This is the introduction to my book. I am urged by my soul and the remembrance/awareness of my own oppressive history to write about disempowerment throughout the history of the human race. Black, white, Native, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, women and children, the abused, the oppressed, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the Arab, the Russian, the Jewish people, the Gypsy, and the colonized. I formerly wrote 80 pages trying to focus on racism from the Black perspective, and I failed 3 times. I revealed my own racism in doing so. So now I have decided to write from my own perspective and my own warts, my own oppression, and my own attempt at growth through the revelation of Baha'u'llah. Through the spiritual path of this revelation, I discovered my powers, my authority of self under God. And I have found that I have a lot in common with those who have been disempowered, though I am a privileged white woman. As James Baldwin said, this past, the Negro's past of rope, fire, torture, castration, infanticide, rape, death, and humiliation, fear by day and night, fear as deep as the marrow of the bone, doubt that he was worthy of life since everyone around him denied it, sorrow for his women, for his kinfolk, for his children who needed his protection and whom he could not protect, rage, hatred, and murder, hatred for white men so deep that it often turned against him and his own, and made all love, trust, all impossible. This past, this endless struggle to achieve and confirm human identity, human authority, yet contains, for all its horror, something very beautiful. I have a past too. I can relate to this passage because I was awakened to horror and its accompanying fear at a very young age, and I came to power, my authority of self, at a more mature age. It was bestowed by God. I found that those who chose to take my power away from me were actually powerless and very fearful, covering it up with a badass attitude. And I keep this power to the extent that I am obedient to the covenant of God. So please join me as I share my journey in search of power, authority of self under God. Though I cannot write from the perspective of Black or Indigenous cultures, I can write from the perspective of one who has been disempowered, degraded, who has experienced and witnessed abuse that caused me desperation, depression for 2 years when I ran away from home because I worried so desperately about the siblings I left behind. And I had suicidal thoughts for 15 years in my 40s and 50s. I have researched the writings of Swiss psychoanalyst Alice Miller, who wrote the book Thou Shalt Not Be Aware, and others in the 70s and 80s, and I was stunned by the fact that she outlined parenting techniques that were then 150 years old. Those parenting techniques now are 200 years old, and they are being used by many parents worldwide, educated or uneducated. I used them myself out of ignorance. They were the beliefs of slave owners who not only took away the voice and power of their slaves, but their own progeny, fulfilling the cycle of abuse that was perpetrated against them by their own parents, thus creating the unending cycle of post traumatic oppressor syndrome. They were the beliefs of those who resented the other. The punishing beliefs of church authority were also meted out from generation to generation through the teaching of the doctrine of original sin. St. Augustine taught that sexual pleasure, even between couples who were married, was lust, and thus a baby was born in sin, which had to be beaten out of him or her as they grew up. There was no understanding of the stages of development, at which point a child, an adolescent, or a youth attained discernment. Children were beaten into obedience, but the slave was thought to be an animal that could not be educated. They didn't understand English and they were not to be educated. Further, we have a history of being a world at war, from Cain slaying Abel to currently 40 wars going on right this moment. These include conflicts in Afghanistan, Algeria, Burundi, China, Colombia, the Congo, India, Indonesia, Israel, Iraq, Liberia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Peru, the Philippines, Russia, Somalia, Sudan, and Uganda. Is there a genetic reason why we fight? Yes, we have war genes, but we also have love genes. And we have a soul which can develop many powerful virtues, powers, which can cause us to ascend instead of descend. There is no single war gene. Combinations of genes can predispose a person to violence. However, aggression is a product of biology, environment, and a belief system that is an imitation of what came from previous generations and lack of education or a projection of unresolved aggression we have experienced. In America, sources of aggression, pardon me, in America, sources of aggressive disposition include domestic violence, the portrayal of violence in the media, threats from enemies and combat training, alcohol and drugs, a feeling of superiority and nationalism. Then there is the ever-present racism and oppression of Native Americans. Patrick Manning estimates that about 12 million slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th century, but about 1.5 million died on board ship. In the ensuing email exchange, a man named Thornton indicated that his own rough estimate is that about 12 million indigenous people died in what is today the coterminous United States between 1492 and 1900. This number of deaths is almost 2.5 times the estimated decline in the indigenous population during this time. War is defined as an active conflict that has claimed more than 1,000 lives. Has the world ever been at peace? Of the past 3,400 years, humans have been entirely at peace for 268 of them, or just 8% of recorded history. How many people have died in war? At least 108 million people were killed in wars in the 20th century. Estimates for the total number killed in wars throughout all of human history range from 150 million to 1 billion. War had several other effects on population, including decreasing the birth rate by taking men away from their wives. The reduced birth rate during World War II is estimated to have caused a population deficit of more than 20 million people. and 6 million Jews, gypsies, and mentally ill died in World War II. Of slightly less than 1 million Roma gypsies believed to have been living in Europe before the war, scholars believe that the Germans and their Axis partners killed up to 250,000, all because they were thought to be racially inferior. The crux of all these deaths lay in the fact that these oppressed peoples were dominated and oppressed by not only those who had greed of power and land, but were steeped in a religion that pled fealty to wrathful, false gods of their own imagination and ignorance that we are all one race. Our world has a history of hatred, greed, and immorality. There has been a long procession of prophets who have come to bring peace and love, teachers of great consequence, to draw humanity closer to God. They started regionally and then spread. But now God has brought Baha'u'llah with a revelation of peace for the entire world, not just for a region of the world. He wrote letters to kings and religious leaders, telling them God has taken their power away from them unless they turn to Him. This brings me to how I was spiritually educated by Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, his son, and Shoghi Effendi, his great-grandson. They who are endued with insight will readily recognize that the precepts laid down by God constitute the highest means for the maintenance of order in the world and the security of its peoples. And more recently, the Universal House of Justice, the current leadership of the Baha'i Faith in Haifa, Israel, put out a booklet titled The Promise of World Peace in 1985, which states, "It is out of a deep sense of spiritual and moral duty that we are impelled at this opportune moment to invite your attention to the penetrating insights first communicated to the rulers of mankind more than a century ago by Baha'u'llah, founder of the Baha'i Faith, of which we are the trustees. The winds of despair," Baha'u'llah wrote, "are alas, blowing from every direction, and the strife that divides and afflicts the human race is daily increasing. The signs of impending convulsions and chaos can now be discerned, inasmuch as the prevailing order appears to be lamentably defective. Indeed, so much have aggression and conflict come to characterize our social, economic, and religious systems that many have succumbed to the view that such behavior is intrinsic to human nature and therefore ineradicable. Whatever suffering and turmoil the years immediately ahead may hold, however dark the immediate circumstances, the Baha'i community believes that humanity can confront this supreme trial with confidence in its ultimate outcome. Far from signalizing the end of civilization, the convulsive changes towards which humanity is being ever more rapidly impelled will serve to release the potentialities inherent in the station of man and reveal the full measure of his destiny on earth, the innate excellence of his reality. The human race, as a distinct organic unit, has passed through evolutionary stages analogous to the stages of infancy and childhood in the lives of its individual members, and is now in the culminating period of its turbulent adolescence, approaching its long-awaited coming of age. I propose that the 30-plus powers of authority of self under God be presented to humanity as a necessary instrument to equip those who have reached that long-awaited coming of age to achieve the full measure of their destiny One can look at them as virtues, but know that the word virtue is used interchangeably with the word power by Abdul Baha. To demonstrate, I'll start with my story of disempowerment and the abuse that ensued. Part one.
Excuse me, Phyllis. We'll just take a little pause as you've come to the end of part A. And before going into the second part, since you're right on time, in fact, you have a couple of minutes more. So I just wanted to mention, everyone, that this is a manuscript from Phyllis's new book. And please put your questions in the chat. We will have question period at the end. You can send to me or to Faye. Thank you.
Okay. I was a child of 2. I had no voice. I had no discernment of right and wrong. I was a child of 6. I had no voice. I had no discernment of right and wrong. I was a child of I was a child of 30. I had no understanding of right or wrong. And I had a secret. I was sexually abused. My voice bled out of my bloodied lips when my mother beat it shut. I had no boundaries. I had no voice. I kept going down the same treacherous road, making the same mistakes. Then came the clarion call. O Son of Spirit, noble have I created thee, yet thou hast abased thyself. Rise then unto that for which thou wast created. I created thee rich. Why dost thou bring thyself down to poverty? Noble I made thee. Wherewith dost thou abase thyself? I was taught to be immoral by an authority figure. One parent trained me to be a sexual object. One blamed me for 6 years of sexual abuse that started when I was 2 years old. I was left with a conflict of values. One blamed me, or lost my place. I was left with a conflict of values. I was terrified of all authority. I stuttered at 30 years old. I had no power. How could I raise myself up from poverty and abasement? I was created noble. All I had ever known was shame. The fundamentalist church I was going to confirmed that I was born in sin. I kept my secret until I was 45 years old. No one must know that I lived in sin. How could Baha'u'llah tell me that God created me noble? How could I tell my first husband and my present husband that I was treated as a sexual object for 6 years and internalize that as a value of myself that I would never shed? How could I tell my husband I was raped one night on the streets of Chicago? I was powerless. I had nonstop sexualized thoughts, nonstop vain imaginings that I continue to fight even now as I approach 80 years of age. And then in my late 20s, I learned about Baha'u'llah's revelation. I was gripped by his words. As I read, every cell in my body vibrated as if he was speaking directly to me. My power of faith started to grow. I began to believe. And when he wrote in Leanings, say, set ye aside my love and commit what grieveth mine heart, What is it that hindereth you from comprehending what hath been revealed unto you by him who is the all-knowing, the all-wise? This was such a gentle admonishment that my heart told me to keep reading, keep studying, and keep striving. I was seen by Baha'u'llah as a person whose actions would grieve him. I wanted to continue to strive because he was becoming more dear. With each admonishment, I recognized him as a gentle father. I began attending a support group and getting therapy, during which I told my secret hundreds of times, but I still had no boundaries, no power. I took comfort in the fact that Baha'u'llah had written that I was created noble. I began reading women's literature and came upon a phrase that captivated me. I wondered what it meant. The 4 women who wrote the book, Women's Ways of Knowing, didn't define it, and I decided to go to Northern Illinois University's library to do a computer search of the literature to see if anyone had written about the phrase that intrigued me, authority of self. Was Baha'u'llah leading me? I searched through dissertations, scholarly journals, and other materials. I found nothing. I paid the librarian to do a computer search. He found nothing. This was in the early 90s. Through the influence of prayer and deepening in the writings of Baha'u'llah, my discernment of boundaries began to increase. I began writing with greater intensity, absorbing deeper meaning about my creation and my journey. I wrote the following: I am the authority in my life. It is pulsating in a heart that threatens to rebel, pushing rhythmically with defiance underneath a whip of self-shame. I was given this authority by my Creator. It talks to me in my very cells, compelling me to rebel. I was beaten into submission by the uneducated who decided they had more authority than God, an authority without the power of reason and discernment, that didn't value my inherent nobility, that held their values higher than God's, and taught my noble soul to submit. But my nobility shone through every blow, and I now bequeath resilience and obedience as a legacy of hope to my children. The values of a debauched system can never erase the resilient values of my spirit and my obedience to God. I decide what values I will choose. If I adopt the evil values of others, and they don't seem to fit who I am as I learn and grow as a Baha'i, then I have the authority to stand alone, apart from children, spouse, family, co-workers, friends, as I seek out values that are more in keeping with what I believe in my heart, with the new knowledge I gain daily from the revelation of Baha'u'llah. I am the sole authority over all my beliefs. If I decide to eliminate a belief that seems distorted because it was not based on my experience, but those of others, then I have the authority to stand alone as I formulate new beliefs based on the concrete or spiritual experiences that I have had. If I discover beliefs that were based on early childhood experiences of trauma, in which I did not have the ability to integrate feelings with perceptions, thoughts, and misguided efforts to make me conform to an illegitimate authority, and the resulting beliefs cause me to be uncomfortably stuck in a place where others are most comfortable, then I have the authority to stand alone and decide anew the adult I want to be and what I want to believe, even if I seem inconsistent to others. I can control my yeses and my nos. If my belief system allows others to control me, then I have the authority to stand alone with strong nose until I help others and myself understand that I am separate from them with my own perceptions, feelings, thoughts, and the Word of God to guide me until I come to a place where I have achieved a spiritual authority of self under God. This knowledge empowered me. The revelation of Baha'u'llah grants us our birthright powers by naming them numerous times in more than 100 books and tablets he has written. I have defined them both psychologically and theologically below for those who have been marginalized by the greed of others, the ignorance of others, the hatred and jealousy of others, the lust of others. Why do they usurp my powers? Because they are distracted by their own myopic vision, which is centered on a belief in the superiority of the color of their skin, intellect, culture, and religion. Through this spiritual education, my hope grew that the ascendancy of love, virtue, in my soul would always supersede and triumph the cellular memory of dominance and oppression if I obeyed God. Part 2, what is authority of self? The authority of self refers to my ability to command approximately 30 powers, attributes, and faculties of which I am aware, and many other virtues that empower me that are too numerous to mention. The words power, faculty, energy, force, quality, capability, gifts, and virtue are frequently used in the writings of the Baha'i Faith to represent power. It is reasonable to assume that most of the oppressed peoples of the world, especially those who are in a migrating pattern due to war, who are in prison, do not have a full understanding that their own powers are marginalized and discounted. Many of those who are educated, have a job, and are well-to-do have difficulty recognizing the extent of their birthright powers. Most are struggling with basic human needs. Psychologist Abraham Maslow developed his theory of self-actualization that proposes a hierarchy of needs. And he does this so that we will be able to self-actualize. Now, in my book, Assisting the Traumatized Soul, I write, authority of self can be defined as the freedom and ability to govern one's self, to use God-given mental powers to make rational and moral choices, self-regulation of the emotions, and the right or permission to act independently with the understanding that one has personal limitations and accountability. To develop a complete understanding of the extent of our powers and our authority to use them, we must be fully cognizant of our limitations and conquer our own misbeliefs or vain thoughts about who we are, why we are here, and how we can best relate to our world. And that was published by the Baha'i Publishing Trust. Abdu'l-Baha says, mankind is in need of new powers and virtues, new moralities, new capacities in the day in which we live. They are fully within our grasp, such as the power of recognizing God. This is a power that is gem-like in every child that is born. The power of speech, the power of choice, the power of discernment, the power of imagination, the power of inner vision, the affective power, the power of reasoning, the power of identity, the power of wisdom, the power of faith, the power of intuition, the cognitive power, the power of reflection, the power of thought, the power of knowing our limitations, discovery, and understanding, the power of will, memory, and individual search for truth, the powers of response, perception, anticipation, accountability, attention, and receptivity, and the powers of induction and deduction, plus the powers of justice, resilience, and love. Unless and until this knowledge is included in the raising up of the disenfranchised, the marginalized, those whose legal right to vote or whose education has been denied them, and those who have been diagnosed as mentally ill, those who have been treated or labeled as alcoholic or drug addicted, they have experienced the tragedy of injustice, and society will continue to face just protests of the lack of power. Even those who need medication to balance their mental health needs would benefit from acquiring these powers to know how to negotiate their needs. And as they absorb and process this knowledge, perhaps science may not need to label them. And then I start defining each of the powers that I read to you. I start with the power of recognizing God or truth. This is a faculty that dwells within each human being that enables him or her to recognize God and his manifestations or the messengers of God. Baha'u'llah advises us the first duty prescribed by God for his servants is the recognition of him, Baha'u'llah, who is the dayspring of his revelation and the fountain of his laws, who representeth the Godhead in both the kingdom of his cause and the world of creation. The power of discernment. Discernment is the ability to see and distinguish the difference between good and evil, degrees of perfection and imperfection, light and darkness, and truth from falsehood. Empowered by discernment, one makes choices that reflect spiritual values. We gain this understanding from the Baha'i writings. Discernment also gives one the ability to comprehend that which is shrouded or hidden in darkness. Baha'u'llah writes, "So great shall be the discernment of this seeker that he will discriminate between truth and falsehood, even as he doth distinguish the sun from shadow." Gaining the power of discernment means educating oneself about what constitute abuse, oppression, and chastity, and identifying the kinds of behavior caused by trauma that are inappropriate to spiritual and psychological health, either for the individual or society. Discernment is supported by the inner vision that leads to us to know the gem from the stone. Now, I define each of these powers both psychologically and theologically. There's a bit of philosophy that I have added as well. And as you can see from hearing the definition of discernment, I was in sad need of knowing discernment, having been trained from 2 years old till 8 years old, my developmental years, not to know good from evil. I was really blind, even at 30 years old, where I would put myself in danger because I did not know how either to say no or how to protect myself, or how to know good from evil. I didn't know there was an evil being perpetrated against me. Celine, how are we doing on time?
Excellent time.
Okay, I'll go through a few other powers. If you want this book, you can, it's out of print, but you can get plenty of copies on Amazon's used book site, and a place called Antiquarian Book Exchange, which is www.abe.com.
Are you saying Assisting the Traumatized Soul? Is that the book you're referring to? Okay.
Yeah. The power of wisdom is the capacity to judge rightly in matters relating to life and conduct. It is soundness of judgment in the choice of means and ends, and discerns inner qualities and relationships. Baha'u'llah elaborates on this. Above all else, the greatest gift and the most wondrous blessing hath ever been and will continue to be wisdom. It is man's unfailing protector. It aideth him and strengtheneth him. Wisdom is God's emissary and the revealer of his name, the omniscient. Through it, the loftiness of man's station is made manifest and evident. It is all-knowing and the foremost teacher in the school of existence. For those who have been oppressed, wisdom is the acknowledgement of whatever God hath clearly set forth. This is the beginning of our healing. We measure our current state of abasement, whatever injustice caused it, against that which Baha'u'llah has set forth in the writings. Utilizing wisdom is often a difficult task, even for those who seem quite mature, but Baha'u'llah helps us recognize that true wisdom appears when consultation and compassion are present. The heaven of divine wisdom is illumined with the two luminaries, consultation and compassion. This shows that we are able to openly discuss what the wise course is, so that we might all benefit from the principles applied. Consultation and empathy help us to look ahead, for all will be affected by any course of action that we think is wise to take. If those who have been abused because of the color of their skin would have access to consultation with those who have trampled on their rights and powers and have acknowledgement of such abuse, that in itself is a measure of reparation. The power of limitations allows us to recognize that the self has limits, creating room within the limits to make some choices, knowing that self-regulation is ultimately an internalized process dependent upon our understanding of the Baha'i writings. It is the ability to recognize, understand, and anticipate consequences for our behavior. I write later on about the power of accountability, and that power is jointly used with the power of limitations. Every created thing will be enabled, so great is this reflecting power, to reveal the potentialities of its preordained station, will recognize its capacity and limitations, and will testify to the truth that he verily is God. There is none other God besides him. The faculty of shame, which guards us against what is unworthy or unseemly, and the fear of God are also a part of the power of limitations. Shame leads us to bringing ourselves to account, accountability being another power. I'm not going to read the power of understanding. The power of perception is not only what we sense or perceive, through our outer powers, the five physical senses, but how we interpret what we see and experience. Perception is also understanding through the senses, because perception can be clouded and influenced by any number of factors. The power of perception must be teamed with the power of discernment. The danger is that our perception may be influenced by a multitude of negative emotions, including resentment, hate, and irrational fear. On the other hand, positive perceptions can be created through emotions or virtues such as patience, courage, magnanimity, and compassion. The clarity of perception can also be clouded by self-interest and conceit. Becoming aware of all these factors may be the process of purification Abdu'l-Baha is referring to when he says, "Purify and sanctify the eyes, that they may perceive thy light. Purify and sanctify the ears, in order that they may hear the call of the kingdom." At the very least, it is the expansion of consciousness that Abdu'l-Baha says is so important. The Baha'i writings helps us fuse discernment with perception. When I was writing this book, my editor, Terry Cassidy, didn't understand that I wrote about the power of identity. She says, identity isn't a power. And I said to her, and she wasn't going to use it in my book. And I was distressed. And I said to her, what happens when you don't have an identity? And she paused. She says, you have no power. So it was an awakening for her. In order to write this book and have it published, I had to teach my editor in the publishing trust about each one of these powers being an actual power listed in the writings of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and the Universal House of Justice. The power of identity is being yourself and not someone else. It is the fact that you exist as a separate entity, expressing self-identity, that you as a single human being are distinguished from others based upon your own attributes. It is acting according to your true self, without hypocrisy or constraint. The power of identity gives you the ability to firmly know who you are, what is important to you, what you think is right or wrong, where you fit in this world. It shows you where your identity ends and the identities of your parents, spouse, children, friends, and others begin, so that you do not enmesh yourself in someone else's identity or allow others to enmesh themselves in yours. We have three basic needs as our power of identity develops: to learn that our identity, what we think, feel, desire, or choose, must be obedient to the covenant of God, to be accepted by those who matter most to us, and to be ourselves. Tyrannical authority says, mirror me, give up your identity, and absorb the role I prescribe for you, which is what in Canada you see people doing to the indigenous people. In contrast, Baha'u'llah writes, O my servants, could ye apprehend with what wonders of my munificence and bounty I have willed to entrust your souls, ye would of a truth rid yourselves of attachment to all created things, and would gain a true knowledge of your own selves, a knowledge which is the same as the comprehension of mine own being. When one's sense of identity is strong and clear, One is not afraid of losing approval, making it an excellent defense against peer pressure. Because the authority of self is an autonomous yet connected state, our identity is connected to all creation. Living in connectedness with others does not mean we give up our identity or individuality. We bring our gifts and attributes in cooperation and reciprocity to achieve that connectedness in an ever-advancing civilization. Abdu'l-Baha has said, "Let all be set free from the multiple identities that were born of passion and desire, and in the oneness of their love for God, find a new way of life." In order to have a balanced life, we need to have self-awareness of the multiple identities he's talking about, such as having a sexualized identity, a dependent identity, materialistic, violent, or victimized, which threaten to push aside the station of servitude that Abdu'l-Baha demonstrated, which is our true identity, that of a servant. The power of utterance. The power of utterance can be defined as the exercise of the right and opportunity to speak, describe, discuss, and explain one's truth, preferences, desires, opinions, and convictions. None of that could I do. Not for 45 years. It includes the right and the opportunity to address the needs of self and others, to ask questions without fear. I was hit if I asked a question. And the right to explore thoughts verbally with someone who listened without becoming defensive or distorting what is said. This power must be used conjointly with the powers of discernment and wisdom. Voice creates more knowing, and knowing creates more voice. Verbal discussion helps to expand thinking and confirm the sense of identity. The silencing of the needs of one's true identity represents an extreme in denial of self and independence upon external authority for direction. The critical and liberating power of speech in dialogue with others precedes the ability to act, the power of response. Man's treasure is his utterance. O my name, utterance must needs possess penetrating power, for if bereft of this quality, it would fail to exert influence. And this penetrating influence dependeth upon the spirit being pure and the heart stainless. Likewise, it needeth moderation, without which the hearer would be unable to bear it. Rather, he would manifest opposition from the very outset. And moderation will be obtained by blending utterance with the tokens of divine wisdom which are recorded in the sacred books and tablets. Thus, when the essence of one's utterance is endowed with these two requisites, it will prove highly effective and will be the prime factor in transforming the souls of men. The power of thought.
Oh, dear Phyllis, we are running out of time, so perhaps that would be the last one.
Okay, let me choose one that I think would be more applicable.
Okay, they are all very appropriate. It's hard to choose.
I know there's about 33, 32. The power of imagination is used to form a mental picture or picture of something not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality. Imagination is especially important to the development of our mental and spiritual gifts. We can imagine as children what we want to be when we grow up. Imagination can help us dream things into happening. Sometimes we will have to test imagination with other powers to see if it is helpful or harmful. If it is helpful, we can create something of value with it. If it is harmful, we will need to make responsible choices concerning imagination. If it is vain imagination, we can correct choices or redirect our thoughts and efforts. Therapy can help the traumatized separate fact from imagination or fantasy. It often happens that reality is so terrible for an abused child that he or she creates a fantasy in which the parent is benevolent instead of tyrannical. I did that. The child uses the power of imagination as a defense to do this, which reveals that imagination has two aspects to it. It can lead us to truth or fantasy. Therefore, the power of imagination must be used with the powers of discernment, wisdom, reasoning, and intellectual investigation. Abdu'l-Baha describes the power of imagination when he states, as to the difference between inspiration and imagination, inspiration is in conformity with the divine text, but imaginations do not conform therewith. Idle and vain imaginations are mentioned quite frequently in the Baha'i writings, but I will include only one reference to them here. Protect us, we beseech thee, O my Lord, from the hosts of idle fancies and vain imaginations. The word host is very illuminating here. A host is an army, a great number. This illustrates how important it is to monitor our thoughts and to continue developing all the components of authority of self under God. Also, this is not just a tool for those who've endured trauma, but for all people. And I find myself having a host of vain imaginations when someone has ticked me off. And I can't stop thinking about it. And I think about what I could have said. And then I think about another thing I could have said. And then I thought, no, you don't want to backbite, and you don't want to gossip, and you don't want to run your life like this. So you just have to stop. And I wish I could read the powers of love and the powers of justice and the powers of accountability. All the powers are important to us.
Well, let's put the question out to the participants to see what they would like to do, because Faye and I have received one question so far, and there might be others. So I'm inviting you to raise your hand if you wish to ask a question. And what I'm going to do now is to stop recording.